The next sample we're going to do is the waistband. The waistband is really a given amount of fabric that is put on. It builds up further into the waist, and it kind of clasps over that seam to finish it. Waistbands almost always will finish all the way up. So you have a night, in this case, of this is a pair of pants. This one will now come right up and straight, so that when you start your waistband, the finished edge lines up with the fly front here and goes all the way around. The extension for the waistband almost always goes underneath. So if you have an extension, which you always will because these have to go over each other, so one is always going to be a little bit longer. So one will finish straight, the other one will extend so it can go over. So that overlapping amount is the extension. And we'll talk about that more as we get into it. But almost all waistbands, so you always have to think whatever part of your zipper is going to be really determining your finished edge, that your waistband is going to line up with that. Occasionally, you will see a waistband where the extension happens beyond the zipper. So this is a design element. This pant was designed so that this button would end up over and the flap would come over. So there's my extension here, if you can see it. I know it's a black pant, it might be hard to see. But this is a case where the waistband is extended on the top. And it's kind of rare to see, but it is, if it's done, it's for purposes of design. So this became, for this particular pant, a design element where the extension is on top. But otherwise, always remember that your waistband will finish all the way up and the extension will be on the underside. So let's go ahead and practice our waistbands so that you understand them. So the waistband pieces that are now have been adjusted from the other pattern, you have your center front, which will be one block piece. You can cut it on the fold, but I had you cut it just in one big piece. We have 1/2 inch seam allowance, and please don't forget to notch the very center front, because that's going to line up with the notch in your waistband. And then you have your two backs. I'm just going to have you this time notch at the center back. So we'll forget the side seam notches for now. Those will be kind of obvious. And again, 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And this will be your hem. Then you have your waistband. I'll hop up here. And your waistband is your total amount of your waist from here to here, plus your 1 inch extension. So that's the piece, as I showed you in the samples, that you'll use to tuck under. And then you have to make sure that you notch on your waistband at every point. It's going to match up. So again, a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. This is going to give you a 1 inch high waistband. So going from, if this waistband is going to open at center back, so going from center back, I have from here, my first notch is where my side seam is. My second notch is where the center front of my front panel of the skirt is. The next notch is the other side seam, and then the next notch is the other edge of the center back, and then I'm going to have 1 inch that's going to hang over. So let's go ahead and learn how to put this together. Oh, and I almost forgot. your interfacing. So here what I've done is I had you cut it and score it ahead of time. So now this, the first thing we're going to do actually is to stitch this. What you can do to help is to get started is to take your waistband, fold it in half, and just trim off a tiny bit, like 3/16 of an inch. It's called scoring, so just score it back a tiny bit. I had you cut it already scored for the lengthwise, so now my nice crisp edge is going to be glued onto, ironed onto my fold line. And again, also too, I forgot to mention, don't forget your notches where your waistband is going to fold in half. Okay? So those are your pieces. Hopefully you were able to get them cut out from the documents I gave you. So let's go ahead and put them together. So the first thing I'm going to do is to sew what's going to be the skirt together. So I have my skirt front, which is one piece. Threads here. I'm going to sew that to the two back pieces, and I'm going to sew the center back seam just to the notch. So again, make sure that you back tack, and when you back tack, just go once back and forth. You don't have to make a big pile of thread, it'll be fine. Then what I'm going to do, so I have my center back seam is open, so we're going to just pretend that that's where the zipper is. We're not going to actually put a zipper in this sample. So what I want you to do is to press open the back seam and to keep pressing it. That's why if you marked your muslin, it'll be easy to follow along and get it as exact as you can. So what I want you to do is press the back seam first so that you really get, this muslin is pre-washed and it's really not wanting to iron very well. So that I now have a nice crisp edge for putting my waistband on. Then I can turn and press open my other seams. So for a sample this small, we can roll it a little bit. Let's see, that can go there. Press open my one side seam. Press open the other. And actually, I'm going to show you a tool that I recommend if you're going to be stitching at home or even coming back to school. There's a wonderful tool that I find extremely helpful, and it is called a sleeve board. And a sleeve board is a little ironing board meant for, you guessed it, ironing sleeves. So the nice thing about this is when you have something small, you can put it over. They're not very expensive. You can find them online. I can send you a link if you want. But there. So now I can iron my side seams. Nice and open. Get rid of that crease I have for the last time. And then press. You know, my lens fogs up when I do this. Is it clearing? Yes, yes. Yes, there we go. Okay, and then here, okay? So now I have my 3 seams pressed and ready to go. The next thing that I'm going to do is to take my waistband and put my fusible right on that crease line. Again, the nice thing about drawing on muslin is you can see, if you're not drawing, you have notches you can go by on the 2 ends. I'm going to line up that nice straight line with it, and again I've snipped off, so now I can see I've scored back So it's just going to be right against the line of the waistband, but you're going to be able to see scantily around it that it's not, and that's really exactly what you want for iron-on. We'll get to sew in when we can. You can use iron-on for this sample. Okay. The next thing I'm going to do is to take my waistband and fold it in half, and I'm going to stitch the two ends here at the 1/2 inch mark, both ends of the waistband. The next thing, so now I've sewn both ends of my waistband. I've folded it in half, and I've stitched them together, right sides together, at the 1/2 inch line on both ends. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is to take my scissor, and I'm going to trim off about half, and then very carefully I'm going to clip to not quite the corner. I'm going to take the corner off so that the fabric gets out of the way, but I'm going to be very careful I don't get too close to the stitching. And now what I'm going to do is to take my waistband and turn it inside out. So just stick my finger in there initially and then push it out so it's nice and neat at a point. Okay? Now, you should try to stay away from using your scissor. Back up a little bit. I'm going to recommend I put a link for a different type of point turner, but I'm going to recommend that you get a point turner because it will prevent you from using your scissor, which will often create a big hole and a mess. So something that's plastic, it'll be really, really good for you to use for your collar and your cuffs on your shirt. So it is a really handy tool to have because it's plastic. And this one comes to a really nice point, so you can see I can really get all of my fabric. So you've clipped away that fabric just to get it out of there, so it has room for that point to get right into where that stitching is. Okay? So that's going to give you a nice perfect point. And of course you're going to do that on both ends. Next we're going to attach the waistband to the skirt. So you're going to take your skirt and turn it right side out and turn it towards the back. And here is where you decide which way your extension is going to be. Now when you're going up the back, there really is not a left or right preference. When you're going up the side, if your opening should happen to be at the side, then you would want the front to be where the clean finish was. And again, I talked about this earlier in the video. So the extension would go over on to the back side. But here on the back, it really doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is take my waistband and see where my extension is, where I've got my notches marked but not clipped. So let me go in and clip them so that I can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to clip, you can clip both sides if you want, but I'm just going to clip where the sewing side. So I've clipped my notches and the interfacing side is the side that goes to the front, the right side of the skirt. Okay, so I'm going to put my extension on this side. So I'm going to start pinning. Here's my notch. I'm going to start pinning here, and that's where my extension will be. I'm catching the press back seam allowance on the other side. I'm not extending it. And I'll pin it there. And then if all goes well, my notch will line up to my side seam. So see here where my notch is lining up to my side seam. So far so good. Putting in a pin here. I'm going to now use my notch and waistband with my notch in the front of the skirt. Again, fabric has its own mind. It stretches, it does things you don't want it to do sometimes, so when things line up like they are right now, I'm very happy. So here's my notch. Even with all the sewing I've done, things go wrong. And then I'm going to go right over to the end. Bring this lines up. You can adjust it. Now, when you get to the end, I'm going to open this up so you can see. When you get to the end, you want to make sure that when you sew, you catch all of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance from both sides. Okay, see there's your seam. You want it all over so that it lines up with the edge of the garment. You want to catch it all. That's going to really help it to give a nice, sharp, clean edge. So now I'm going to go in and sew, and I'm going to put it into the machine down here. I'm going to start right at the edge here, not where, so I'm back down where my extension is, and I'm going to start sewing at my 1/2 inch at the extension, and I'm going to sew all the way around until I get over to my front clean edge, and then I'll back tack here. I'm going to back tack on both ends, but this is the part that's going to end up clean edge with your seam. So now my waistband is stitched on. There's my extension, and then I've come all the way around and gotten into the corner. So now when I turn this, see, it's all nice and smooth, one piece. So now let's get in. We're going to trim a little bit of this off as neatly as we can. So I'm going to have you trim back your seam, your waistband seam, and then what we're going to do is to press it up. To press it up. So working from this side so that I can really see what I'm doing here, I'm going to come in and I'm going to trim back probably in half again. I'm going to trim off the waistband. Be super careful you're not catching anything underneath. And when I get to the end here, what I typically like to do is to treat this separately. So I'll take the skirt and clip it, and then I'll take the top and kind of clip it to the out, right to the corner. So I'm leaving a little bit in there. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to fold this over and to press my seam allowance towards the waistband so I get a nice crisp attachment on the outside. Okay, I'm going to use my sleeve board again just so it'll be easier for you to see. I am at an awkward position here, but I'm now going to take this seam with the seam with the interfacing and all, and press it up towards the body. Up towards the waistband. There is a sleeve board in the studio if you're on campus. There is a sleeve board. If you're not, I think it's a good idea to probably invest in one. I mean, I use mine all the time to get into these tight places, like for these small samples, and also when I'm doing sleeves, particularly for the tailoring that I do, you almost have to have one. I kind of caught there a little bit. Okay, so I'm all pressed now and ready to close it up. Then what you want to do is to take your waistband and fold it in half. On the extension side, what you can do is to fold up the seam allowance that came off the waist, but leave this go for now because that's your flexibility, that's your chance to make any adjustments. But now basically what I want to do is to press on my fold line of my waistband all the way down. And then we'll be ready to close it up. Okay, just going to press that all the way. When it gets to the other end, same thing on this end. You want to press this up, but just leave this alone for now. Okay, and again, we're just looking to create the crease right now at the fold line, which should be right at the corner of where you turn to the corner for your stitching. Okay? We're going to be closing up the waistband by hand sewing. There are a lot of other ways to do this, but this is kind of the basic waistband 101. You can Google for other ways to do this, but this is the way we're going to do this sample. So we're going to be hand sewing the almost a blind stitch or a hem stitch really that will attach the this back side to this seam here. So I always start in center front and then I work out. So what you're going to do is to just turn under your seam allowance, whatever is kind of left there, and you can put a pin in. And you're going to do that all the way around. So you're going to turn it so that it just meets that seam allowance. So this is where is kind of, this process kind of leaves you with some margin of error. So if something goes wrong, you can usually adjust it in this process. When you get to the clean finished edge, what you're going to do is simply fold everything under. So you're going to almost take it, if you hold it open, the seam open here, and then crease where your seam allowance is, and then fold it over, you should get a nice clean finish. And then you can go back and make adjustments to it as you go along. I'm going to stick a pin in this direction to hold it, and then I'm going to go ahead now and fold the rest of this under here. I'm so happy I moved to the 1/2 inch because this got pretty tiny and difficult to do with the other pattern that I made. Okay, and I'm going to do that now all the way around. When I get to the other end, okay, so I've turned it all under, all the way to the other end. When I get to the other end, I'm going to do the same, almost the same thing, except on this end what I'm going to do is I'm going to spread this seam allowance open. Come on. Open, and then fold it over, and then kind of snap it into place. And that will give you a nice, neat extension that this is going to get blind stitched here. And then I can go back in now and fold the rest of this under. Okay, so get that all in place, and there's also another method of pressing the seam allowance under first. I stay away from that because, again, things shift and change. I want you to really have some success and feel good about this. So we're going to do it this way, but just know that there are other ways to do this. Okay? Then we'll go on to the hand sewing. Okay, so it's nice and neat. Let me turn it to the right side so you can see how beautiful your waistband is. Nice and neat and finished. And again, now I have a place here. Again, pretending there's a zipper in here. I have a place for your zipper would stop here, and then you have a place for your buttonhole and an extension for your button. Okay, let me show you how to finish this up with hand stitching, and then we'll be done. Except don't forget to run a serger around your edge for the hem, just to keep your sample nice and neat. Okay, hand sewing. So again, I'm going to use a contrasting thread just so you can see. I always make sure that I have not too much thread. I had one of my advisors always said never longer than your elbow, so that it doesn't get all knotted. But to prevent that, I almost always use beeswax on my thread. Now this happens to be an old candle. It was actually a turkey. It's an old candle that I use, but I love beeswax candles, so I just use the ends of them. But you can get beeswax in Joann's, but if you just take your thread and run it through the wax, even just once, what it's going to do is not only strengthen the thread, but it's also going to help to prevent it from knotting while you're sewing. Okay? So let's get the waistband attached to the skirt. So always in hand sewing, I recommend that you go in, I call it burying the knot. So put your needle in somewhere far along the way behind it, and then come out where you want to be, and your knot is going to get buried inside. So when knots get what I call agitated or worn, that's when they come out. So between the beeswax, burying your knot, you should be good. This is not going to come out. Okay, so now I'm ready to go. Let me zoom in just a tiny bit here so you can see. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the stitching of the waistband and then just pick up a few yarns in the fabric. Okay, I'm going to pick up the stitching in the waistband, so I'm sewing my waistband seam allowance to the thread I used to attach the waistband. And here. Okay, again, my stitches on this sample probably 1/4 of an inch away, so I'm picking up again my stitching, and this way, I'll get a little extra yarn there. This way what'll happen is that it's not going to show from the outside, but it's going to be nice and secure on the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and do that all the way down. Again, I know sometimes students like to rush things along, and they will make their stitches really big. Try not to do that, because the time that you spend is going to make just the garment all that much better. Okay? So you can go ahead and do that all the way to the end, and I'll show you what to do when you get to the extension. When you get down to the end, this is where you're going to need to blind stitch. So the best thing to really do is to just, again, make sure that your extension is nice and neat. And actually you can give it a good press too. That will really help in sewing it together. I'm going to just put a pin in this and to hold it still, and then I'm going to zoom in and show you. I'm not sure if you learned blind stitch last semester or not, so let me just zoom in here. So a blind stitch is where you're really kind of sewing inside of the seam. So what you're going to do is you're on one side or the other, it doesn't matter. Wherever you are, whichever side you end up on here, you're going to go directly across from it. You're going to stick your needle into the seam allowance and let it kind of snake through and come out. So see, your thread's buried. Now the next stitch, I'm on this side. I'm now going to go into this side, to the other side. So I'm going to snake in. The trick is to get this stitch right across from this one. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to see how I'm in the seam allowance there, and I'm going to pull. Again, this is where the beeswax is really handy. Again, I'm going across. Yeah, I really need it. Make sure you give it a good press before you start this so you can see. I'm kind of losing my way here a little bit. Across. See how it's right across? And you can see it's disappearing. Again, right across, no more than 1/4 of an inch. Coming out. Directly across, snake through the seam allowance, out, and one more across, and out, right at the point. Right at the point. Okay. There you go, a nice blind, and again, once that gets a good press, obviously if it was the same color you wouldn't be able to see it at all. So it really benefits you to do it with a contrasting color while you're practicing it so you can really see the end. Take a little. Tuck. Make a knot. Again, another knot. Now you're going to snake your fabric again. You're going to snake your thread again. You're going to go inside. So yeah, you will see a little bit of the knot, but again, you'll have thread that matches. I'm going to snake inside again the seam allowance, and I'm going to come out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a little pull on the thread so it's taut, and then I'm going to cut it so that the tail will end up inside of the seam allowance. So here we are. There's your waistband and ready to go. Again, don't forget to make sure that you finish your hem somehow. Either run it through the serger just so the sample is neat.